Okay. So, scalar implicatures. Mike, can you remind me how?
Command 1.
N1?
Command 1.
Command 1. Okay. Why does it like this? Okay, I don't want this. Okay, well, good enough. All right, so yeah. So what are scalar implicators? So some of you, can I ask you who of you has heard about scalar implicature already?
I think most of us.
Good.
Because we had this pragmatics introduction.
Oh, that's great. So some stuff
Asymmetric, sorry.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So if what I'm saying is too, you know that already, or it's too slow, please make some noise and raise your hands. Okay. Still, I see people that did not raise their thumbs, so probably not everyone. Is there any one of you who's never heard about implicatures or who knows very little about that? Don't be shy, please.
I think I didn't.
Good. So we're going to start, we're going to have this kind of, rehearsal all together. Okay. So the whole idea about implicature starts from a very, very extremely influential work of this guy, who you might have heard about already, who is Paul Grice. Okay. So Paul Grice in 67 and 75, he published Logical Conversation, which is this very influential book about basically modern pragmatics. He sort of invented modern pragmatics. And he basically, from his book, you can already see he did not define scalar implicatures in the way that we talk about them nowadays, because that benefited from the following works by his students, who are now kind of old, like Larry Horn, Levinson, and also other people like Atlas and Gazdar, and so on. But the idea, the core ideas were already in the original volume. Okay, so right. So the idea is that an implicature is a pragmatic inference that enriches the meaning of an utterance. Okay, so let's say that we have two people entertaining a conversation. This guy here. Okay, so one is defined as the speaker, or the sender of the message in more theory of information terms, and the other one is the addressee, or the recipient of the message. Okay, and the idea of scalar implicators is that these are inferences that are triggered by certain lexical items, like for instance some. Okay, the existential quantifier. So let's take an example. Our speaker here says, John danced with some of the girls. And you should remember who John is, John Travolta, right? And then again, let's say that the context he had in mind was this one, in which John Travolta was dancing with two girls, but these other two girls that were salient in the domain were dancing by themselves, okay, or with other people. So the idea is that when someone says a sentence including a scalar trigger like some, the addressee entertains an automatic reasoning, which is often called Gricean reasoning. Okay, so this reasoning unfolds as follows. The addressee, this guy here, who's hearing what this guy said, he knows that the speaker observes the Gricean maxims. Okay, now I haven't found a slide of my Gracia maxim, so let me have a look if I find it right now. No. So I'm gonna, unfortunately, I don't have a blackboard, which would be very, very useful in this moment, but I'm just gonna tell you basically without the blackboard. So the Gracian maxims are 4, okay? And they are called maxim of quantity, maxim of quality, maxim of manner, and maxim of relation. So the Gracian maxim of the conversation, they are sort of rules of conversation, but not performative rules. So they're not like those kind of rules that a teacher tells you to follow in order to have a good conversation or in order to write a good paper. They are some sort of default rules of how human communication should take place, basically, and they are some implicit rules that the agents of the communication always observe. And all these four rules or maxims, they are in a way governed by a higher principle, which is called principle of communication. Okay, so the principle of communication says that you have to be cooperative. Okay, in a communication, you have to be cooperative with your addressee. Now, this is actually quite trivial, right? Because why wouldn't we communicate if we don't want to be cooperative? Well, you can imagine certain situations, certain contexts in which you don't care at all to be cooperative, right? For instance, if your mother is bothering you about putting a sweater because it's very cold outside and you might get sick, and you're already wearing a sweater, right? And so you just want to tell your mother that you're fine, but she doesn't believe you, and she's like, no, Daniele, you really have to put a sweater, you're gonna get a cold. And you say, okay, mommy, this is a nice day, have a nice day, bye-bye, and you just get out. Okay, that's not being cooperative. That's actually being anti-cooperative, because you really don't want to continue the communication. Okay, so these are, let's say, some limit situations that are not part of a normal conversation. In a normal conversation, you want to be cooperative and communicate as much as needed with your interlocutor. Okay, so this would be the principle of cooperation, right? To cooperate with your speaker, with your addressee, and make sure that the communication flows in a sort of effective way. So make sure that the other agent of the conversation understand what you're saying, and make sure that you understand what he's saying, and things like this. So underneath this overarching principle, you have these 4 maxims. Okay, so the maxim of quantity, as the word says, it's about the amount of information that you're conveying during a communication, during a conversation. Okay, so the idea is that you should not say too much, you should not be too prolix, but also you should not be too concise. You should not say too little. Okay, your contribution should be adequate in terms of the information included in your message for the purpose of the conversation. So you can summarize this maxim in don't say too much and don't say too little. All right, this is very important, because this is the very maxim on which we compute scalar implicature. And then you have other maxims, like, for instance, be orderly. Don't say things in a random order by which your interlocutor might not understand what you're saying. Okay. Be relevant. So say things that are relevant to the communication, right? And again, I always think about my mother when I make these examples, because sometimes I'm I'm conversating with her about certain things, and then she says, yeah, but have you seen my cactuses in the garden? And I'm like, yes, I've seen them, but like, how is this relevant to what we're talking about, right? So every time that someone violates a maxim of the conversation, we have a specific, we sort of have a problem, or we have a specific phenomenon, right? One of these phenomenon could be what we call flouting. So basically, when you are explicitly violating the rules of the conversation for a specific purpose, okay? For instance, to make a joke. You might not tell the truth because you're making a joke, right? So you don't want to deceive your interlocutor. You just want to make a stupid joke. So that's also, you know, an interesting example. But according to sort of, you know, the standard of a regular conversation, the rules, the maxims should be always observed. Okay. So one is quantity. The other one is, again, quality, tell the truth, manner, be orderly, and manner, quality, quantity. What is the other one? Relevance? Probably?
Relevance.
Relevance, right. So be relevant. Okay. So again, this is quite interesting. We are not going to talk about all these examples, all these maxims, but we are going to focus on the maxim of quantity. Why? Because it's very relevant for this kind of inferences. So let's say that our speaker said, John danced with some of the girls, okay? Now, the addressee assumes that the speaker is observing the Gricean maxims, right? And the addressee knows that the speaker could have uttered the sentence, John danced with all of the girls, okay? So the point is, why didn't the speaker utter this sentence instead of uttering the sentence with some? So the inference, the first inference that the addressee makes is that the speaker has used the word some instead of all because he was not in the position to utter all by the maxim of quantity, okay? So the maxim of quantity is not just about the number of words or the length of the speech that you're making. It's also about the content, the amount of informativity that is included in the amount of information that is included in your message, okay? And then again, if we want to have a criterion to define information, that's one very useful criterion is logical entailment, okay? So in some framework, you can just substitute informativity or informativeness with logical strength, okay? So now I ask you, consider these two sentences. John danced with some of the girls and John danced with all of the girls, okay? And try to remember a little bit what we talked about the last classes, especially the first class. And please tell me, do these two sentences stand in an entailing relationship? Is one of these two sentences entailed by the other? And if so, which one?
I would say that the sentence John danced with some of the girls can entail John danced with all of the girls.
Can entail.
Yes.
So if the sentence with some is true, then it follows that the sentence with all is true.
Wait.
No,
I would say the
not
opposite.
necessarily. Yeah, exactly.
The other way around, actually.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah, I mean, you know, it's good to make mistakes. So thanks, Zarko, for being brave to take the first guess, right? So probably in your intuition there was something that is different from entailment, right? Which is compatible. So probably what you wanted to say is that the first sentence is compatible with the situation in which John danced with all of the girls, which is actually repeated by the second sentence, right?
Ah, yes. Okay.
But the entailment, if you remember, is that relation that allow you to be sure that the other sentence is going to be true if the first sentence is true, right? And by assuming this, by considering this, if we know that John danced with all of the girls, we also know that there are at least some of the girls that John danced with, right? Yes. So that was right. The second answer was right. A sentence with all entails a sentence with some, right? Good. But now some of you might tell me, yeah, but look, it's not really true, because the way that I'm telling you that this guy is interpreting some is by the interpretation some and not all. So if some means some but not all, then the entailment relationship is broken, right? This is exactly the effect of the implicature. So let's make one step back and let's say that the addressee inferred that the speaker could have uttered all, and then from the fact that the speaker did not use all, the addressee infers that the speaker did not have enough evidence, was not in the position where his beliefs were strong enough to utter a sentence with all, and therefore he uttered a sentence with some. And then from this, the conclusion is that the sentence with all is false, does not hold, okay? So as a consequence of this inference, the original sentence, John danced with some of the girls, ends up meaning John danced with some of the girls, but not all, okay? So when you derive this implicature, what we say it happens is that you are enriching, you are strengthening the original utterance, because again, you are making it stronger, okay? So the sentence enriched with the implicature, which is this one, John danced with some of the girl, but not all, ends up being stronger, more informative than the original sentence with some, without the implicature, okay? Again, if it is true that John danced with only some of the girls, or with some of the girls but not all, it is also true that he danced with at least some of the girls, right? So this, in a way, the original sentence, the original utterance, according to its literal interpretation, that's how it is defined, this sort of at least logically very weak interpretation, right? This original sentence, not only is it weaker than its alternative with all, but it is also logically weaker than the same sentence enriched with the implicature, okay? So it's, in a way, it's the weakest sentence that you might have compared to these other interpretations that are, one is considered and the other one is derived, okay? And we are going to talk about that. So, right. So, someone might argue, okay, this is very interesting, this is very cool, but like, why do you have to come up with a new concept? Why do you have to come up with a new definition for something that is just the meaning of some? Why can't we say that some means some but not all, period, right? Or that this stuff that we call implicature is actually a part of the meaning of the semantics of some, or a part of the meaning of the semantics of the sentence. You see my question? And the answer, which was already provided by Grice, is very important. And it's about a special feature that these inferences have, which is their cancelability or diffeasibility. So the idea is that you can cancel this inference without any sense of contradiction. So without contradicting yourself or without changing your mind, okay? And for instance, you can say, John danced with some of the girls. In fact, he danced with all of them. It is Saturday night, okay? So the idea is that if you add this kind of continuation where you are actually uttering the strong term, it's not that you are changing your mind, you are just overriding the meaning of the implicature. And that can be done without sense of contradiction because logically some is included by all. It's entailed by all, okay? Do you see this example? Good. So this is like, I'm not like, playing some rhetorical tricks with you. There's a lot of debate, still a lot of debate undergoing this phenomena. And, sometimes it's not easy to convince people that actually the interpretation of some, but not all, is not included in the meaning of some, is not part of the meaning of some. So, because oftentimes if you utter a sentence with some, then you are automatically or very strongly deriving this inference. So, one way is to play the game of the bet, or to put to refer to a sentence with some under ellipses. Okay, so if you say, for instance, I don't know, did you do some of the homework? And you can answer, yes, I did all of it. Okay, so your yes is referring via ellipsis to the question that your speaker asked you. And when you say, yes, I did all of the homework, you are literally saying, yes, I did some of the homework. In fact, I did all of it. Okay. So by ellipsis, you are saying that the sentence, that the answer, which is equivalent to the, which has the same form of the question of your interlocutor, was true. And then you are communicating even more information that in fact you did all of the homework. Okay. So in some way, some can really be interpreted logically with its lower bounded interpretation. So it's called lower bounded because it has a lower bound, which is at least 1, but it does not have an upper bound. So it does not have an upper limit. It can go beyond up to its maximum logical power, which is all. Okay. And then when you derive the implicature, and when you add the implicature to the meaning of the sentence, then you get the upper bound, which is not all, okay, excluding the stronger item of the scale. Okay, so yeah, let me skip this. Right. So in the neo-Gricean view, which is basically the development of the original Gricean theory by his most loyal followers, okay? Among them, Horn is probably the most important. There was a more precise characterization of how these inferences come about and also about the maxims, okay? So the maxims, now they're kind of thought of in terms of heuristics, communication heuristics, okay? So they're not really maxim because the term, the maxim sounds like the term rule of conversation sounds like a prescriptive rule. The neo-Gricean wanted to be precise in, making explicit the fact that these maxims are not really some sort of rules to follow, but they're more some sort of heuristics, so automatic strategies that we employ always during normal communication, during natural communication, okay? They are very, very similar, but the new definition is rather like communication heuristics. And the most important aspect of this is that, for instance, Horn claims that in order to have a scalar implicature, which is also called Q implicature, so Q stands for quantity because it's based on the maxim of quantity, okay? In order to have a scalar implicature, you need to have a scale, you need to have a Horn scale, which has some specific characteristics. So the members of the scale, for instance, sum and all, if we consider the quantifier scale, okay, they have to belong to the same semantic family. They have to be equally lexicalized, and they have to be ordered in an asymmetrical entailment relation. Okay, so the asymmetric entailment relation is something that we kind of talked about already. Basically means that one has to entail the other, but not the other way around. And we're going to come back to this. Equally lexicalized means that you cannot have one term which is one word and the other term which is made of 4 words, okay? And they have to belong to the same semantic family, meaning that you cannot take a different scale, a member of a different scale, to be an alternative for your quantifier scale, okay? Can you make me an example, for instance, with sum, of another item that could have been introduced in the scale, in the scale of sum, but it should not be introduced in the scale, otherwise it's going to give you bad results. Like, you know, anything. For instance, if I say, yeah.
So you mean like something that should not go in the scale?
Yeah, something that is
I don't know,
violating
10?
and
Probably not the same semantic family.
right, very good. So what would happen if we had and? Let's say, so our sentence is John danced with some of the girl, right? And then you have, and then you're saying, okay, why we could have and, right? So let's say, and he drank a beer, okay? So if, and you see that actually this is going to give you a stronger alternative, right? Because John danced with some of the girl and drank beer is stronger than John danced with some of the girl. And then you want, so then you just apply the same reasoning, you exclude your stronger alternative, and at the end of the day, you get this sentence that says, John danced with some of the girls, but he didn't dance with some of the girls and drank beer. Which basically means that he danced with some of the girls, but he didn't drink beer, right? And you see that this is not exactly the inference that we are talking about, but it's a very nice example because actually you could have this inference, right? If you say, John only danced with some of the girls, right? That's something very similar to what you said. Because in fact, you can conjoin sentences to make alternatives, for instance, for other kind of inferences, like for instance, the exclusive inference of only, or the exclusive inference of focus, right? So some people, including me, might actually claim that this is exactly the same kind of inference. But you see that by choosing a different scale, you would get a different effect, right? So the real inference, some but not all, which actually can be made explicit either by adding not all or by using words like some and focusing the scalar item, right? So
I have a question. Sorry.
please.
So belonging to the same semantic family, does that mean so it has to be a quantifier, or does that mean it has, like, for example, we have numbers which are also quantifiers but are not the same as the universal quantifiers of existential.
Exactly.
So that would be a different scale, right?
Exactly. And then you would get a different inference. So then you would get an inference like John danced with some of the girls, but not more than 5, right? Which is not, again, the inference we are talking about. Again, someone might say, look, Sam has this inference that that you are talking about a low number of people, right? So then again, someone might say, yeah, but sometimes you even have a low numerosity inference. True. But then it's not that you exclude exactly the number of 5 girls or 6 girls or 7 girls, right? You have to do some more work. And especially, it is not the inference that we are talking about right now, okay? And other examples, for instance, you have it with adjectives. So I hope I have these examples here. Yeah, cool. So the other nice thing about scalar implicatures is that actually it's quite a universal phenomenon. So every time that you have a Horn scale of elements that obey to this, that sort of obey this rule, that undergo this property, then you have a scalar implicature. So, for instance, take logical connectives. If you say I will buy a car or a bike, the most natural way to interpret this sentence is that you're not going to buy both, right? Otherwise, you would have said, I will buy a car and a bike. Or modals. You should do your homework by tonight. Doesn't mean that you must do your homework. In fact, it kind of suggests that you are not obliged to do your homework, but it's good for you if you do them, right? Or sometimes, for instance, you see that in a conversation where you say, "Oh, wait, do I have to read this book?" And then someone tells you, "You can read it, right? You don't have to. You can." It's exactly the same kind of implication. Adverbs. I sometimes go to the cinema. Doesn't mean you always go to the cinema. In fact, it means that you don't always go to the cinema. Adjectives, scalar adjectives, gradable adjectives. If you're saying, so how is it today? Yeah, today is quite warm, right? You are suggesting that it's not boiling hot. But still, warm is compatible with hot, right? And then you can see that with the same trick. If you say, how is it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be warm? Then you can answer, yes, it's going to be hot. Or you can also answer, no, it's going to be hot, right? So the idea is that if you answer no, you are objecting to the meaning of warm, which was already strengthened via the implicature, which again you can make explicit by adding only. So it's not going to be only warm. It's going to be more than that, hot, okay? But you can just say, yes, it is going to be warm. In fact, it's going to be hot. And right, and then you also have, verbs like believe and know, love like, and stuff like this, right? Of course, you don't always have this implicature, right? So for instance, if you say, I don't know, I like my father a lot, right? You're not saying that you don't love your father. You're just saying that you like him a lot. In fact, maybe if you say that, you're also going to love your father, right? But if someone asks you, oh, do you love that person? And you reply, well, I like it. I like him or I like her, right? You are sort of suggesting that you do not love, you don't have a complete adoration for this person, right? So you see that these inferences are very context dependent in a way. So if there is a context that does not support the inference, you do not derive it. But at the same way, they bear some special relationship with grammar because they are triggered by these items. So they're not just triggered by the situation, by the contextual situation in which the conversation takes place, but by some specific grammatical items, grammaticalized, or specific class of items like adjectives, adverbs, verbs, and so on and so forth. Okay. So people may, in the original Gray's definition, there was this difference between generalized scalar implicatures, generalized conversational implicatures and particularized conversational implicatures. And the idea is that the stuff we are talking about, they are generalized because they are systematically triggered by these items, whereas particularized scalar implicatures, they are really depending on the context. So, the classic example by Grice was the one of the recommendation letter, okay? So let's say that you are opening a call to hire someone, right? And then, like for instance, I apply for a job. My current boss writes a recommendation letter for me, and this recommendation letter says, Daniele is a good scholar. He has a good handwriting. Okay. Period. So, except from the fact that it's not true, my handwriting is horrible. So that would be a violation of the maxim of quality. But let's say that I have a good handwriting. Clearly, that's not that's not what you should write in a recommendation letter if you want to say certain nice things about the candidate, right? So the idea is that someone would write something like this to communicate a conversational effect, which is that of saying that Daniele is not a particularly great scholar. All I can say, all I have evidence to say is that he has a good handwriting. As for the rest, I don't know, I don't commit myself, right? Which is not a great thing to write in a recommendation letter. Is this example clear? Okay, so this would be a case of particularized scalar implicature, because you don't have a grammaticalized scale made by handwriting and skill of supervising students, skill of teaching, skill of writing papers, and so on and so forth, right? So you have to come up, you have to build up with scale, this scale starting from the context, okay? Whereas when you use these items, the idea is that the mere use of sum automatically triggers the activation of the scale. And when you activate the scale, then you are sort of forced to derive this implicature. Okay? This is basically the base. Yes. And the last thing, again, we talk about the same things again. Entailment, logical implication, right? So what is entailment? Now you should know it better than I know. A entails B if the truth of A brings the truth of B. If A is true, B is true as well. And in our quantifier scale, all is called strong item because it entails some, and some is called weak item because it is entailed by all, but the other way doesn't work. So some might be compatible with all, but it does not entail all, right? We have seen that, right? So this is called unilateral entailment. or asymmetrical entailment. Why? Because one item entails the other one, but the other one does not entail this item, okay? If both items were mutually entailing themselves, then you would get something like either a biconditional or an equivalence, okay? And we don't want to have this for scalar implicature. Right. And then the trick that you play is always the same. You see in this, we are talking these four scales. We consider this would be the weak trigger, right? This is what we utter, and this is a strong member of the scale, which is then denied conversationally. So sometimes means not always, some means not all, A or B means not A and B, and may not must, right? Now, there are a lot of subtle effects that might come into play. For instance, you might have noticed that here, I also put often and many, right? If I tell you, I sometimes go to the cinema, right? Or you ask me, so Daniele, what are you going to do when the coronavirus crisis is going to be over? And I tell you, well, you know, I'm going to go sometimes to listen to live music, right? Do you infer that I won't go very often to listen to live music? Do you have this inference or not?
No, I would say it could mean often.
Right. So in this context, for instance, often would not be included in the scale, right? And so it would not be canceled, okay? But you can come up with a different example, and then, for instance,
But like
yeah.
most of the time, would that be acceptable?
Most of the time could be another member of the scale, right? So you see
But
that,
I mean, because you said that like lexicalized, that they have to be lexicalized in the same way. Like most of the time is very different. So
right?
that's does that even count?
Well, you know, that's $1 million question. People have been arguing for this over 20, 30 years, right?
Okay.
But if you take the time scale, right? Sometimes, most of the time, they're quite similar, right? I mean, it is true that it's like different words, but you might say that sometimes it's morphologically complex and includes an existential quantifier and then a variable ranging over intervals of time, right? So again, you know, your point is completely on the mark. Even this definition of horn is a little bit, you know, tricky. It doesn't always work, right? But you see that there is a tendency I mean, there is a sort of the necessity of constraining the scales. And you know why? Because there is the biggest problems for scalar implicatures, right? And many people have not understood this yet, is that if you do not limit your algorithm by which you're going to derive the implicature by only considering certain alternatives, you're going to get any kind of crazy effect. Because anything that you say in natural language could be put into a scalar relationship with something else that is more informative. Anything, right? If I tell you, okay, I'm going to make a coffee now, right? You might, you know, come up with an alternative that, I don't know, I will make a coffee and I will not kill anyone this afternoon. And then by having this alternative, you derive the inference that actually I will kill someone this afternoon, right? And hopefully this is not going to happen. So this inference is completely unwarranted. And this alternative, under normal circumstances, is not going to be It's not going to be part of our conversational background, and also it's not going to be active, right? But, you know, let's say that I tell you, look, today I'm really, really crazy. I want to kill someone, right? But now I'm just going to make a coffee. And now from this new context that I set up, you're actually inferring that I'm going to make a coffee and not kill someone, right? So big problem. How do we constrain the space of alternatives? How do we constrain what we say? And, you know, one standard definition of this is that you activate all those alternatives that are relevant for the purpose of the conversation, or that are relevant or salient in the discourse. Okay. Now, again, this is not going to be it's not going to help a lot, because what is relevant, right? The notion of relevance, even in its more systematic definition, it's very, very circular. So usually you end up saying it is relevant what has been included as an alternative for an implicature, right? So then you are defining something by its own behavior that you are trying to explain by using the very same definition that you had, which is the definition of circularity, okay? So problems, unsolved problems, but, you know, at some level we have some sort of reliable intuitions that we do derive these inferences and that they can be canceled, okay? Okay, so, right, before moving on, I would take our break now, if you agree, and we can meet in like 5 minutes, okay? Good. Okay, so, yeah, so we have seen what scalar triggers are, and also we have seen a couple of dimensions, linguistic dimensions, where we could have scalar implicatures. Now let's quickly see some issues about implicatures, like, for instance, certain interesting issues that have been brought up recently in the so-called grammatical approach to scalar implicature. Like, it has been seen that the scalar implicatures interact with certain features, with certain grammatical features, or with certain operators that are present in the sentence in which they are triggered, okay? One of these examples, for instance, is the case of indirect implicatures that we are going to talk about in the next classes. So when you have a sentence including a negation and a strong item, like all, which should not derive any implicature, because the idea of scalar implicatures is that they are triggered by logically weak items, so not by strong items, okay? So if you say, John danced with all of the girls, there is no scalar implicature introduced by all, because it's already the strongest, the most informative thing you can say. But the idea is that when you have a strong item under certain operators, like, for instance, negation reverts the logical relationship in the scale, and then your strong item becomes a weak item. So when you say, I didn't eat all of the biscuits, then you are suggesting that you ate some, right? So the idea is that you derive this implicature by having as an alternative of not all, not any, or none. Because if we have seen that this a little bit when we were talking about scope ambiguity, right? If you have a sentence like, John ate no biscuits, this sentence is logically stronger than John didn't eat all of the biscuits, because if you don't eat anything, it is also true that you didn't eat all of the stuff that are available. and then you negate the stronger alternative, and you have something like, I didn't eat all of the biscuits, but it's not true that I didn't eat any of them. Therefore, I ate some. Okay. Another interesting thing is what has been called Kierkegaard's intrusion or weakening implicatures. So the point is that by the standard Gricean algorithm, right, in order to have an implicature, you need to have, you need that the effect at the end of the day you're going to achieve is that of increasing the informativeness of the sentence, increasing the informational content of the sentence, and getting something that is logically stronger. The problem is that sometimes you have these implicatures in contexts where they don't make the sentence stronger, but they make it weaker. Like, for instance, conditional dissident. So, I mean, we're not going to talk about this a lot right now, but just trust me, if you say, if you eat some of the pizza I made, you'll be satisfied. But if you eat all of it, you'll go to the hospital, right? In order to make this sum non-contradictory, you have to interpret it as some but not all of the pizza, right? If you eat a piece of the pizza that I made, you're going to be fine. But if you eat all of it, it's going to be too much, you're going to go to the hospital, okay? Now, it can be shown that this some but not all embedded in a conditional is not making the sentence stronger, but it's making the sentence logically weaker. How is that possible? Well, the idea is that there's some way in which you compute this implicature locally without considering the whole phrasal context. So basically, just considering you eat some of the pizza, you eat some but not all of the pizza, and then you embed this sentence in a larger context, which would be the conditional. Okay? Or that you force the presence of the implicature with a sort of a silent operator, like a silent only, okay? Which is rather different than adopting the Gricean reasoning that I told you before, okay? All right, and then there is this other interesting observation that sometimes implicatures are not optional. They're not diffeasible. They are obligatory. So for instance, when you have a sentence like, John will either dance with some of the girls or with all of them, okay? If you interpret this some as some and maybe all, the sentence ends up being weird because for certain properties called the Harford constraint, when you use a disjunction, the two disjuncts must not be in a mutual entailing relationship. One must not be logically stronger than the other, okay? So long story short, if you have a sentence with some and all, under disjunction, some must carry the implicature in order for disjunction to be felicitous. So this means John will either dance with some of the girls, but not all, or with all of them, okay? And this seems not to be defeasible. Right. Or again, if you stress the trigger by putting intonation focus, then the implicator is very, very difficult to cancel, impossible to cancel. So for instance, if someone asks you, did John dance with all of the girls at the party? And you answer, he danced with some of them. And it's not natural to continue the sentence by saying, and as much as I know, he might have danced with all of them, right? It sounds that you are contradicting yourself. So if you put stress on the scalar item, you make the implicator obligatory. And again, this is not so simple to explain in the standard Gricean framework, because along with that algorithm, everything is really about some sort of deductive reasoning that you compute, right? Which we sort of laid out before. Okay, and finally, yes, and finally, one of the most important observations is that it seems that you can have these implicatures computed at the embedded level. Again, a little bit like the case of the intrusion, but also in contexts where they actually they don't necessarily give you a weaker sentence, but they give you a different pattern of inferences. Okay, so for instance, you say every boy who dances with some of the girls will be happy, but every boy who dances with all of the girls will be tired. Okay, and again, this is a downward entering context, so it's not actually an ideal example, but you see that in this sentence you must interpret some as some but not all. But if you do this at the global level, you are gonna have certain problems, because then the meaning of every enters in the computation of the implicator. So when you deny your stronger sentence, which would be every boy who dances with all of the girls would be happy, you get something like not every boy who dances with some of the girls will be happy, which means that some of the boy who dance with all of the girls won't be happy. And that's not exactly what we want to get. Okay. So again, problems. All right. So the last thing that I want to tell you about theoretical notions about scalar implicatures is this. There is a quite lively debate in the literature as to what kind of operation is responsible for deriving scalar implicature. So for instance, some people claim, following the Gricean idea, that scalar implicatures are computed into two steps. So first you start with the literal meaning, some and possibly all, and then you derive the implicature and you add the implicature. Okay. But other people say, no, this is not actually necessary, because, you might have, for instance, some sort of lexical ambiguity between, as soon as you hear some, you activate both meanings, the meaning without the implicature and the meaning with the implicature. And then you just select one of the two meanings depending on the kind of context you are in and depending on the intention of communication and a lot of factors. Okay. So usually you would use a stronger meaning, but then if the context does not support the implicature, you would choose the weaker one. Okay, you see the difference. Two steps. You must start with the logical meaning, and then you derive the pragmatic meaning, the meaning with the implicature. One step, you have both representation immediately available, and you just pick one that you want. And yeah, and there have been done a few experiments, a quite bunch of experiments, investigating the issue about online processing. And some of these experiments, they found that when you do derive the implicature, you have a processing cost, or you have a sort of a delay effect of the implicature, which would suggest that you really go through these two steps. Whereas other people say, no, we found that the strength meaning with the implicature, the some but not all meaning, is immediately accessible. You can immediately interpret some as some but not all, and there is no necessary cost for deriving the implicature. And along with these theories or these proposals, you would have a model like this, okay? Because there is no cost, because your meaning is already there. All right, and this kind of gave rise to what some people call the Pragmatic Wars. And if you want to know more about that, I can send you some more slides, okay? Okay, so, if we want to say something a little bit more about the algorithm that underlie implicator computation, for instance, some people talk about probabilistic models or probabilistic approaches. So that some is really lexical ambiguous among only some or some and possibly all. And then you have a sort of a probability computation about which one of the two meanings you should use in a specific situation, depending on how often you associated that kind of situation with one of these meanings, okay? Whereas in the grammatical view that I mentioned, the issue of whether you are gonna derive the implicature or not is really something about syntactic ambiguity. So when you have the implicature, you add an operator which derives the implicature, which is called the exhaustivity operator. When you don't have the implicature, you don't add it. And the presence of this operator, which is basically a silent only, is completely optional. You can have it, you cannot have it. And you can have your preference with respect to having it or not, okay? Whereas this so-called pragmatic approaches, so the approaches that are mostly loyal to the Gricean original idea, they entertain two steps. So first you start with your pure existential for some, which means some and maybe all, and then you derive some and but all as an implicature, as an additional inference that you add on top of the literal meaning, okay? So here you see a clear division of labor between semantics and pragmatics, whereas here there is no such a division of labor anymore in the original Gricean terms, okay? You might say pragmatic here is just deciding which meaning you want to adopt, and pragmatics here is just having, let's say, a principle that tell you how often you should put this operator, okay? And, you know, there are evidence kind of supporting each one of these models. And the idea is that these models are not so incompatible among each other, okay? So for instance, probabilistic approaches and grammatical view share the idea that you have some sort of ambiguity at the basis of scalar implicatures. Whereas probabilistic approaches and pragmatic approaches share the idea that implicatures are computed very rapidly, at least according to some particular models, and that, and then this implicature is a sort of a mental act, a sort of a mental deduction that comes from the use of your pragmatics, and it's not really some grammatical operator, okay? So differences and similarities. Okay, so so is there any question about this theoretical introduction? Are these concepts clear? Can I go on? Okay. So, so in the last 20 minutes of our today's class, I will tell you something about a famous experiment that has been done some kind of 16 years ago by Lewis Bott and Ira Noveck. And the title of this, should I do this? No. Okay, whatever. So the title of this paper is Some Utterances Are Underinformative, the Onset and Time Course of Scalar Inferences, okay? And it was probably the first processing experiment on scalar implicature. So the theoretical background is comparing the neo-Gricean theory to other approaches. So the neo-Gricean theory, as I told you, the neo-Gricean term should tell you something that is really close to the Gricean original insight, right? And it has a kind of a basic assumption, which is this. So it makes a prediction about the rate of scalar implicature computation and the rate of adding the implicature to the meaning of the sentence. And the idea is that they are computed by default. So every time you hear a sentence with some, you automatically compute the implicature immediately, because you always observe the Gricean maxims. You always assume that your interlocutor observes the Gricean maxims. Therefore, this is a sort of an automatic reasoning. However, if the context does not support the computation of the implicature, then you cancel the implicature. Okay? So you derive it immediately by default, and then, and also, you know, given the fact that you do this by default, the assumption is that implicature computation is quite fast, is quite effortless. Okay? You do it by default, you do it quickly, you do it fast, and then if you realize that your utterance context does not support the computation, you cancel them at a second time. Okay? So yeah, this is the tenets of the Neo-Gricean framework. Okay? Default, defaultism, relatively effortless computation, and then later cancellation if not supported by the context, which seems reasonable. But then there is an alternative approach called relevance theory that comes from this book by 95 by Dansperber and Wilson called relevance theory. So as the name itself says, relevance theory is based on relevance. It represents an effort to substitute all the Gricean maxim that I told you with a super maxim of relevance, which tells you that make your contribution to the contribution to the communication as relevant as possible, and derive any inference, any implicature, which is basically contextually driven, which is supported by the context. And then this derivation is going to be not super difficult, but costly overall. And the less relevant or the less salient your implicature is, the more effort you're going to have to put into deriving it. Okay? So no derivation by default. You only do it if these inferences are triggered by the context, if they're supported by the context. And then you have to spend a little bit of your cognitive resources to do this. If they are well supported, if your alternatives, for instance, are very salient, then you're not going to spend too much of effort. If your alternatives are not really salient, right, but you still derive the implicature, then you're going to spend a lot of cognitive effort. And you see there is already a problem with this, right? And the problem is this. The problem is that the same principle that in one situation would tell you not to derive the implicature, in a parallel situation, when you do derive the implicature, it would tell you that you have to spend a lot of effort. Okay? So again, circularity problems about this theory, a lot of people had told about, a lot of people try to solve them. Big pragmatic wars. Okay? We're not going to go into that right now. Just the important thing is that you understand the gist of the proposal, which is scalar implicatures are contextually driven. They are not computed by default anymore. And they're only computed if the context supports their computation. And their computation is relatively effortful. So you see the differences between the two approaches, right? In the Neo-Gricean theory, you compute always the implicature. And then, if they're not supported, you have to cancel them. And you have a cost when you cancel the implicature. Along with the relevance theory, you only compute the implicature when needed. And if you do that, you have a cost. But if the implicatures are not supported at all by the context, you do not compute them, and then you don't have to spend any of your cognitive resource. Okay? Is this clear? Any question? Any doubt? Anything that you haven't understood?
Can I ask something?
Sure. Hi,
Um,
Maria.
Hi. So in the Neo-Gracian theory, they sort of support that because they are computed by default, they're computed in one step, or they don't care about how many steps they
No.
do.
On the contrary, the Neo-Gracian theory is the theory that that assumes that there are two steps, right? In fact, in the original, so yes, so I mean, I understand what you're saying. You're saying if according to them there is no cost, right? Then it should be sort of immediate, right? So that's actually a good point. But now I don't have the slide anymore. Sorry. Yeah, I closed it. Anyways, yeah. So the idea is that according to the Gracian theory and the New Gracian theory, your algorithm, your only algorithm to derive the implicature, is to reason about the alternative utterance that that the speaker could have made, right? Or if you are the speaker, to sort of reason about things that you don't have enough evidence to say, right? And then on the addressee side, the first thing that you get is the literal meaning. So the first thing that you do is to sort of compute the utterance, to assign a grammatical structure to the utterance, and then to make your semantic composition of the utterance, ignoring completely pragmatics or whatever, right? And then after you have your literal meaning, your some but not all, then you start reasoning about the intentions of the speaker, about the evidence that the speaker could have had, about whether the speaker is using Gracian maxims. And your conclusion is, yes, speaker is using the maxim, he is obeying the maxims, he is being informative, he is being cooperative, he didn't have evidence to use all, therefore the sentence with all is false. And this pragmatic reasoning is computed on top of the semantic meaning, of the semantic interpretation. So a very clear notion about this comes a little bit from the idea of modularity of language, and Levison is quite explicit of that. So that implicatures are computed by a sort of a pragmatic module, right, which takes as input the output of the semantic computation. They are very, very specific, very, very explicit about this. Now, nowadays these things are a little bit controversial, right? Especially because we know a lot about what is called incremental processing and incremental interpretation of sentences. So we know that actually the real way the communication happens is that you try to anticipate as much as you can from what your speaker is telling you, right? And even in the experiments that we are going to look at, all the effects that we find, most of the times, they happen to take place before the end of the sentence. So how is that possible if you compute the implicature on what we call the sentence meaning or the whole proposition, if you haven't got the whole proposition yet, right? So, I mean, there are different ways to overcome these problems, right? So you might say, okay, even if I don't hear the whole sentence, I might actually complete the sentence, I might anticipate the sentence and use my bet, my anticipation of the whole sentence, my prediction, and I use that in the pragmatic reasoning, right? So there are a lot of different versions of this to try to overcome this problem. But what is important to know is that along with the classic Neo-Gricean theory and Gricean theory, implicatures are computed in 2 steps. Okay. Whereas if you want to claim that they are computed in 1 step, you must assume some sort of ambiguity at some level, because the critical difference is that according to some sort of Neo-Gricean view or something very compatible with that, like for instance, Brihini at some point, he had this idea of a Gricean algorithm super fast. So then he would try to solve the problem of the timing of the computation, but being loyal to some sort of Gricean algorithm, right? And yeah, and so and the idea is that in these terms, the implicature is always derived. You never have the some but not all meaning anywhere in your lexicon. Every time you have to derive it, and you have to derive it by adopting the Gricean reasoning, okay? Whereas according to people saying that you compute the implicature in 1 step, you must have stored your some but not all meaning somehow in your lexicon or in your mental lexicon, okay? Is this clear? You still look a little bit puzzled. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thanks for the question. It was very useful. Okay. Right. So again, you know, this is stuff of like 16 years ago. Then if you read normal papers, things in many papers are framed in a different way, right? But there are still many papers that actually are kind of loyal to this way of exposing things. Right. So the prediction was very simple. If Neo-Griceans are right, you should find the cost when the implicature is not supported or when people do not derive it. If relevantists or contextualists are right, you should find the cost when the implicature is derived and not when it's not supported. Because when it's not supported, you don't do it, you're fine, you're good. Okay? So, here's the experiment. Probably the most famous experiment on implicatures. Bott and Noveck invented this terminology for sentences called underinformative, meaning that they sort of provide a fragment, a portion of the amount of information that would have been required by this kind of sentence. Like for instance, some elephants are mammals, okay? If I tell you that some elephants are mammals, would you think that I'm saying something reasonable? Or you would think that I'm saying something strange? Yep.
I would think it's strange because to me all elephants
Right.
are mammals.
We know that all the elephants are mammals, and being elephant implicates being mammal, right? So why the hell did I say some, right? I mean, in a way, it's obvious that some elephants are mammals because all of the elephants are mammals. So all entails some, and some is true. But the idea here is that if you compute the implicature, you interpret the sentence by the meaning that some, but not all of the elephants are mammal, which is plainly false, right? So the idea is that if you answer true to this sentence, you haven't computed the implicature. If you answer false, you have computed the implicature, right? And then they had appropriate controls, like some mammals are elephants, this is right. Some elephants are insects, this is false. All elephants are mammals, this is right. All mammals are elephants, this is false. All elephants are insects, this is false. Okay, so they had all these control conditions in order to check that just by substituting all with some, you wouldn't get strange effects, okay? And the critical condition was this. And this is called under-informative sentence. Another way to define this sentence is to call it pragmatic violation. What does it mean? Is that if you interpret this sentence pragmatically by adding the implicature, then it violates your knowledge about the word or your knowledge about the context in which this sentence is evaluated. So if you interpret it pragmatically, it would be false, but if you interpret it logically, it would be true. That is the definition of pragmatic violation or under-informative sentences, okay? All right, so what I said was, look, let's come up with a task where we force our participants to respond either logically or pragmatically, okay? So logically means by using the logical meaning of some but no, some and maybe all, and pragmatically by using the implicature, some but not all, okay? So they said, okay, I'm gonna give you a lot of sentences, but please answer logically. And they trained them to do this. Or I'm gonna give you a lot of sentences, please answer pragmatically, okay? And then they say, okay, if in the new Griceans are right, the logical responders, since the implicature is obligatory, the logical responders must cancel the implicature, okay? If the contextualists are right, the logical responders are just fine. The pragmatic responders, in the critical example of the under-informative condition, the pragmatic responders must be deriving this implicature against the context, okay? So according to the new Grison, you should find the penalty, more effort in the logical responders. According to the contextualist, you should find the penalty, more effort in the pragmatic responder, okay? And what they found is that the logical responders were more accurate and faster. The pragmatic responder, sorry, it's not logical responders, the participants in the logic experiment, right, in the logic conditions, those who were forced to answer logically, they were more accurate, they were faster. Those who were forced to answer pragmatically in the critical condition of some elephants are mammal, okay? They were making more errors, a lot of more errors, and they had much, much longer response times, okay? So the response time is measured from the time that you finish here in the sentence to the time you press the button, okay? So just from this data, who's right? Which theory is supported by these results? The Gricean approach or the relevance theory? So just to remind you, the Griceans say that you always derive implicatures, and then if they are not supported by the context, you have to cancel them and you have a penalty. The relevance theory says that you only derive the implicature if it's supported by the context. And here you have a context that does not support the implicature, but you are telling people how to behave, so you are forcing the implicature in the pragmatic condition. And that's the condition where you have the greatest cost, the greatest cognitive cost. So does this support the idea that it is canceling the implicature that is more difficult, or that is deriving the implicature that is not supported that is more difficult? I know it's tricky. It takes some time, but please take a guess.
So as I can see, as I'm interpreting this, is having a pragmatic view is more costly, time-wise, meaning, well, wait, I'm sorry, I just mix up the two.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
Meaning that the Gricean is more accurate, right?
The Gricean is more accurate. Let's see
Wait.
why. The Gricean would say that you have to, so you always derive the implicature, right? So even the logical responders would have to derive the implicature, and then they would have to cancel it. Whereas the pragmatic responders, they don't have to cancel it, although it is contradicting the sentence. I mean, you see that this is actually a mess, right? This is a mess because it's kind of weird to tell people what to say, right? So let's move to the nicer experiment, which is where the people were left free to decide what they wanted to do, okay? And here, so there were no instructions. People were just asked, answer what you want. And they found that 60% of people said, no, it is false that some elephants are mammals. And 40% of people said, yes, it is true that some elephants are mammals. Okay. So now it's kind of clear because the logical responders did not compute the implicature. The pragmatic responders did compute the implicature, although it was going against, it was not supported by the context, okay? So now the predictions are clearer. Now, the Griceans would say, you always compute the implicature, right? So here, you compute the implicature, and then you say the sentence is false. Here, you compute the implicature, but then you have to cancel it, because then you say that the sentence is true, right? So the Gricean predicts that you are going to do more work, that you're going to spend more effort when you provide a logical response. Whereas the relevantist would say that you are going to do more effort when you actually derive the implicature. When you answer logically, you don't do nothing. You just stick to the logical meaning of the sentence, right? So Gricean would predict more cognitive cost for logical response. Relevance theory would predict more cognitive cost for the pragmatic response. And again, oh yeah, it was already this one, sorry. And again, they found that the pragmatic responders took more time to respond, okay? So who's right?
The not Gricean, I'm sorry, the other ones.
Yes, very good. Very good. I mean, don't worry, this is confusing, especially the first experiment. But now that I told you this, you see, right, also why the first experiment was kind of in the same direction. So when you force people to answer pragmatically, you're going to have higher response time. When you leave people free to decide and they answer pragmatically, then you're going to have a penalty again, okay? So this suggested that it's really when you compute the implicature that you spend time. When you don't compute the implicature, you're just fine, okay? And then they had a final experiment when they gave in one condition 3 seconds to answer, and in the other condition only 1 second. And guess what? They found way more pragmatic responded, so rejection of the pragmatic violation, when there was more time. When there was less time, people computed less implicature and provided more true answers, so more logical responses. So again, when I give you less time, you're going to be more logical. When I give you more time, you're going to be more pragmatic because you have more time to compute the implicature. Hence, the implicature is costly. Hence, it's not automatic. Hence, it's not by default. You do it when you want to do it, but when you do it, you have to pay. Okay? So to wrap up, scalar implicatures are not derived by default, right? Also here you see that if 60% of people provide the pragmatic response, means that 60% of people compute the implicature, meaning that 40% of people did not compute the implicature. And one interesting thing about this is that oftentimes when you have these kind of experiments, you have a median, like a binomial distribution, where half of your subjects behave like pragmatic responders and the other half as logical responders. Why? We don't know yet. Right, so implicatures are not derived by default. They do require processing time, and the literal meaning is more readily available than the pragmatic one. So here's comes some confusion about Maria's question, because this kind of suggests that implicatures are computed in 2 steps, even from the relevance theory perspective, right? And unfortunately, in the following experiments, this confusion only kept increasing. Okay, I'm not gonna make names because these people might actually see these slides or these videos. So I want you to make names because I don't want to be exposed for this, but see that there are a lot of problems and a lot of issues that has not been solved yet. Okay, so yeah, so their conclusion is relevant theory better account than Neo-Gramscian defaultism. And in a way, they were right in rejecting the idea that scalar implicatures were derived by default in this kind of context, okay? If there is one take-home message from this study, is that it is true that implicatures derived by some are not always computed. And it is true that you're going to find a lot of people that accept the logical meaning, okay? And it is true, it's found in many experiments, that we do not, when you do compute the implicature, you find sometimes a cost. Not always, but sometimes. Okay. I think I'm kind of late, so I would stop here. If there is any question, I'm going to stay here for a few more minutes. And if not, I wish you a good day. And I'm going to have a chat with 3 people that are going to present next time. Right? Okay. So, bye-bye. And have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao, grazie.
Bye-bye.
Well, I also just wanted to ask if you got my email, because I also wanted to do it the next week on Monday.
Yeah, so wait a second that I try to stop this.